This time, I'm going to ask our ushers to come forward. They're going to have a stack of Bibles. If for some reason, because you had to get up earlier or later perhaps than you normally do, and you forgot your Bible this morning, they would just raise a hand, and they would love to give you a Bible this morning. They're going to walk up and down the aisles with Bibles. And if you need a Bible this morning, just raise your hand. We'd love to have one in your hands this morning so you can make sure I'm reading God's Word properly and not making up things. Sometimes I do to see if you're checking, and then I check the comment cards on Monday morning. And Keith Haas-Ellison always catches me. All right. I don't do like Pastor John either. I don't give you that whole reverse Stensether version to give you a hint. I just do it. Okay. I love going to McLeod. We talked about it a little bit last week. The college group, we went 2 weeks ago. We had a great time there. And every time I go, I get really, really embarrassed in front of this little church. There's a woman named Annie Marrow. And I've known Annie Marrow since I was, I think, 4 years old. My dad was a pastor. And this is not a made-up town, in Hayfork, California. Okay, it's called Hayfork, California, in the middle of the mountains. My dad was in his early 20s. He was a youth pastor. He put on a youth event, and he had invited like towns from 100 miles around because it was the mountains, and they're not as close together. And for some reason, this is a God thing, these 2 junior high boys came from McLeod, California. They were the new pastor's kids of the new pastor in McLeod. And they came all the way over, an hour all the way over from McLeod to Hayfork, and they came to a youth event. Later, Dad moved to Monte Vista Chapel here in Turlock, and at that time, the mill in the town of McLeod closed, and they were considered an economic disaster area. Every job was gone, everything. And so in 1984-ish, the facts are hard to nail down because my dad's memory is going. He's not here, is he? I'm good. My dad's memory is going. It is hard. He's like somewhere between 82 and 85. So I go 84. That's a good round number. He started taking teams to McLeod, California. He took high schoolers, and they would hang out there, and they would do work. The first trip was like 80 kids. And the population's only like 1,000 people, so you can imagine what that was like. We've taken less since then because of the poor church can't sleep, all of us. And so every year since then, we've been taking these trips. And the man named Cliff Merrill was there, and Cliff died about 6 years ago. And my dad doesn't go anymore. And through the years, Kevin Hepner and Brad Quillen have carried this trip on. And I have carried this trip on. And so every year I go, Annie makes me stand up with Louie. And she gets tears in her eyes. And she talks about how neat it is that the sons of the guys that started this thing are good friends and continue this thing forward into the future. And this is something really cool to me. There's something powerful about 2 generations, the generations of sons and daughters carrying on the work of their parents, carrying on the passion and continuing in strong relationship, not just working together, but in relationship together. They're good friends. Whenever we go, we like to be able to take Louis and his wife Rose out to dinner, and we just hang out and listen to them and see what God's doing in their church. Realize we took a walk while we were in McLeod this year with the college group, and we walked into the mill area. This is about I think it's 400 acres of buildings that have been empty for 25 years. They're like ruins. One of them is huge. It's about 6 stories tall. It's got to be 50 yards wide, and it's got to be 200 to 300 yards long. It's this huge, empty drying building for the wood. And we walked among those at night, and you can see Shasta in the background, but it's just this ghost town. And it made me realize, walking among the ruins, that there are things that man builds that thinks they're really important. And you walk among this town, and remember, this mill was one of those old school mills that owned the whole town. They owned every building, they owned the railroad, they owned everything. Could you imagine in the 1960s, you probably thought that mill was going nowhere. That was going to last forever. And it didn't. And as we stood among those buildings, myself and the college students, we were realizing that the relationships that we have, this generational relationship we have with McLeod, will do more for eternity than these buildings ever could. And you stand among these things that men build that they think will last, but it's the relationships that we have built over the years, through 2 generations now, that will last in God's eyes. It's with this in mind that I think our second kind of church under construction value gets penciled in here. Remember, these are all in pencil. If you remember last week, the vision team is preparing us and building the core values of our church, otherwise known as a kingdom concept. And that kingdom concept is the core ideas of who we are, both who we are and where we're going into the future. Last week I talked about the word truth, that we are a truth, almost driven church. that we are based, as Brad so eloquently prayed, we're based in the Bible. That we are a Bible-believing church, and in the core level of who we are committed to the truth. We are a truth church. And as we looked at this church under construction over the next few weeks, and we are in some ways a church under construction, we looked at the second word. And remember when you filled out those sheets of paper, those little bookmarks? We circled 4 each. And the second word that was circled almost as often as truth was a word called generational. That we are a generational church. That this seemed to ring true. By the way, you may say, what does that mean? I don't always know. I don't. These words are really cool because we're exploring them as they pop up. That's why I say they're in pencil. These are part of the discussion we're having as a church, not just 16 people in a room, but an entire church trying to see how has God created us uniquely to serve Turlock in ways, and they're wonderful churches, but in ways Monte Vista can't, and New Life can't, and Denair Nazarene can't, and United Methodist can't. What are the ways he built us different? And one of those words that rang true for a lot of us was this word, generational. Now, if you have a Bible, I'd like you to turn to Isaiah 58 this morning. Isaiah 58. And I think God's word has a great message for us on how powerful this word was in the word of God. How powerful generations were and generational thinking was in God's word. Isaiah 58. A little bit of background on Isaiah, which is kind of a horrible thing to say since it's a huge book. It's hard to do a little background, but we're going to go for it anyway. He's writing in the 8th century BC, so a while ago, 2,800 years ago. He's predicting at this point, he's going out into the world and into Judah and Israel, and he's predicting that the Assyrians are coming first, and they're going to take out the northern kingdom of Israel, these 10 tribes of Israel. He's also predicting that about 50 years later, around there, the Babylonians are going to come in and drag the nation of Judah off to exile. So not only is he calling that northern Israel is going, but Judah's going as well 50 years later. Can you imagine how popular he must have been? He wouldn't have been. Could you imagine if I got up every Sunday and say, hey guys, I'm going to go with 48 and a half years. China's coming across the sea and taking us out. And most of the church, specifically Turlock, will be going to China. Not because you want to, because they're going to take you there. Would you believe me? No. One of you might, and you need help. Okay? But the rest of you would not. You wouldn't be, whatever, Jeremiah's crazy. And you would start to ignore me. And after a while, you'd probably start to get a little irritated. It's said that many of the prophets were saying, everything is fine, or politicians, everything is fine, everything is fine, everything is fine. And you have this one voice, Isaiah, and overlapping him is this guy named Jeremiah. And they're going, no, there's no peace. Bad stuff is coming. Bad stuff is coming. There's these things coming that are going to destroy us. And this is the first 40 chapters of Isaiah. He's telling about their sins. He's talking about why God's going to do this to them. At some point, northern Israel's taken out. We don't even know where those tribes are anymore. They're just gone. It's one of the great mysteries of the Bible. The 10 tribes of Israel do not exist anymore that we know of. They're gone. They're gone. 50 years later, here comes Babylon in to take them out. By the way, he was so unpopular, the book of Hebrews says there was a man of great faith who was sawed in half, and that would be Isaiah. They got so annoyed with him, they threw him in a log, and they sawed the log in half. Ow. I would stop at that point. Once the saw came out, I'm like, I'm good. Everything's going to be fine. We're going to be fine. Yep, I wouldn't have done it. Nope. No sawing in half for me, thank you. In fact, you know what's amazing is he sees so far, and this confuses scholars today, Isaiah sees so far that he actually knows there's this Persian Empire coming to help Israel reestablish their land. So not only does the first 40 chapters talk about, hey, here comes this destruction, we're going to be taken out, the next 20 or so, 26 chapters talk about, but God will give us our land back. And here's what it's going to kind of look like. And he gets to see almost 50, 60, 100 years into the future and see that not only is God going to take them out, but he's going to bring a remnant back. And in this passage is where we're sitting dead center in Isaiah 58. He's looking to the future, and he's seeing not just Israel destroyed and Judah destroyed, but the remnant of people wandering back from Babylon back to Judah. And this is the dead set context for this moment. They are in the middle of starting to rebuild Jerusalem, and he sees it. Isaiah sees it clearly as a prophet and writes it down. And for some reason, it's very funny. Could you imagine people reading it back then? They would have been like, why is he writing this? Well, it wasn't for them. In some ways, this part of Isaiah was as much for the people 100 years later as it was for the people then. So he's almost writing to the future saying, you are going to be fine. And here's what he says. Isaiah 58, verse 9. Isaiah 58, verse 9. And he says, you shall call, and the Lord will answer you. What refreshing words after 50-something chapters of destruction. You shall call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. Which is always the human response when God calls us. If you remove the yoke from evil among you, the pointing of fingers and the speaking of evil. What's he say? He says, I will be among you if you remove this yoke of oppression from among you, if you stop the pointing of fingers, and if you stop the speaking of evil. I like this, first of all, for this Sunday, this verse specifically. I like it because he's not saying stop sinning so much. He's not saying stop this crazy things you're doing. At this point, Israel's learned not to worship idols. They've kind of figured some things out. He's saying something. Remember, Isaiah is writing to this future. Imagine, I need you to imagine this with me. Imagine coming back, and these people are coming back into their town in utter ruins. Your house is a wall this high, not the house you used to have. Imagine leaving Turlock for 50 to 100 years, and you come back, and everything you knew is gone. Even Latif's is gone. That brings a tear to my eye, I'll tell you that much right now. That sounds good, though, doesn't it? Okay. Some pie, sounds nice. Everything you know and love is gone. Costco, everything's just gone, okay? It's all gone, and you come back, and you just, imagine, I need you to have a visual image of them standing for one moment, utterly overwhelmed among the ruins of their culture, of their parents' and grandparents' culture. They stand among their town, and it's just flat. They live on this hill, and the wall around the hill is gone. Everything is gone. And he's writing to these people, because I think they were thinking of something very specific. In fact, I guarantee you, I love the idea of Ezra and Nehemiah bringing the people back. Do you remember this part of the story? After Babylon, after the exile, Nehemiah and Ezra bring everybody back. And I can see them dusting off like Isaiah. What's it saying here? And they read this part, and they look around, and they see something. What do they see? They see the people going, our parents messed everything up. It's their fault. Our parents, look at this ruins. What did they do? A bunch of morons. They ruined everything. It's all their fault, and it's that person's fault, and it's that person's fault, and they just, forget it. Man, we're going to have to redo all this because they messed up, and we had to pay for all of it. And so what does Isaiah say? Stop pointing fingers. Stop. It's one of the great difficulties of a generational church, that sometimes the generations point at each other. Well, this is your fault because you wanted drums in the church, okay? Your fault, okay? And it's your fault. You wanted to keep that thing with the pipes. I don't even know what it's called, okay? But you want to keep that thing up there. It's your fault. And we point at each other. I love this. I love when Ezra's speech in the book of Nehemiah. Ezra doesn't ask forgiveness of just himself. He asks forgiveness for his parents. Listen to this. Now, therefore, our God, the great God, mighty and awesome. That's a way to start a prayer. That's a good prayer. I like that. That's a Pastor Johnny prayer right there. Who keeps his covenant of love. Do not let all this hardship seem trifling in your eyes. The hardship that has come on us and our kings and leaders, on your priests and prophets, on our ancestors and all your people. From this day, from the days of the kings of Assyria till today. And all that has happened to us, you've remained righteous. You have acted faithfully, while, listen, we have acted wickedly. He didn't say, while they had acted wickedly. Ezra asked forgiveness for things he never did. He accepted the responsibility of every generation of Israel into himself in that moment. There is a generational responsibility there as a community that I see. This is where generational gives us power. That every generation takes responsibility for everything happening to everybody. So I can get up and say, I'm sorry for this, and it may not have been me, but I'm saying sorry anyway. That's exactly what Ezra did. He gets up. It wasn't him. He says, I'm sorry. It wasn't them. I'm not going to blame them. I've stopped the pointing of fingers. We take responsibility for each other, and we stop blaming each other. As a generational church, I take responsibility for the people around me. I don't blame them. The 80-year-old cares about how the Awana kids are growing in our church. And the high schooler loves the fact that we still own an organ. That's what it means to take responsibility for each other. We look at things and we don't blame the other generations. We take excitement in their success and the things we get to do to enhance their lives. So the blaming stops and the taking of responsibility starts for the people of Israel right here. And we stop hearing things like the youth are destroying our church. We stop hearing things like the older generation is holding us back. We stop hearing resentment in words and feeling like somehow our group is being shorted. This stops in a truly generational group. And this started in Israel 2,500 years ago. Taught us the way. This guy Isaiah, writing 2,800 years ago, taught us the way right here. He said, look, stop pointing fingers, stop speaking evil, stop. You want to be this generational thing? You want to be like Ezra, taking responsibility for all generations? Stop blaming. Oh, by the way, in the Hebrew, this means something very complicated. It means stop blaming each other. Did you catch that? In the Hebrew, I don't even know how to pronounce it. It means stop blaming each other. There's no deep meaning here, okay? That's the meaning. Stop it. Stop it. In Hebrew, it's stop it, okay? That's just what it is. Just stop doing that. It's a huge part of our church. It's a huge part of the church, by the way, that Dave Rollins on our board has decided to put together right now. They pulled me aside when I started a year ago and said, look, we want a culture here that is direct speech. One, we're going to have direct speech as a church. No more passive speech. We're not going to do that. We're just not going to do that anymore. Secondarily, when we look at the past and try and figure out what happened, we're not blaming anymore. We're done. We're not looking back and going, well, somebody screwed that up 10 years ago or 15 years ago. We're done. We're going to understand that maybe a mistake was made, but we're done blaming. We're taking these words very seriously as a church. It's a generational church, and we're understanding that God right now is trying to do stuff in our church under construction. And that was just verse 9. That was pretty good, huh? Verse 10. Yeah, here we go. If you offer food to the hungry, this is Isaiah 58:10. If you offer food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom will be like the midday. I like this idea that we rise with our giving. That when we become a generous church generationally, we give to the other generations. But I'll get back to that a little bit more later. Verse 11, the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places, being written in the desert, and make your bones strong. And you shall be like watered gardens and a spring of water whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins will be rebuilt. Remember, they are standing among the ruins as they're reading this. He's seeing them standing among their ruins in the future. The ruins of their town and their home. And they're trying to figure out that all their hope they had in life is in ruins around them. Can you feel that bleakness? Can you feel that? Can you feel like looking around at ruins and feel like there's hopelessness to this whole thing? Sure you can. Because one of the things I stood among the ruins in McLeod, of the ruins of a great mill. And I realized it was not too different than standing in parts of Turlock. How many empty warehouses do we have in downtown anymore? How many places do we have we have a town that's moving toward a little bit of ruin. A little bit of things breaking down. We look around us and the manufacturing is leaving, and we have empty buildings around us. And our downtown, while they're doing a good job, still has a lot of empty buildings in it. And we see ruins. We see it's the echo of a greatness that we fantasize about we once had. Notice I use the word fantasize. Ruins remind us backwards. They're a symbol that great things happened, but they're gone now. They're gone now. This town had industry, and now we have empty buildings. Take a drive through Turlock today on the way after the lunch. Don't do it before. After the luncheon, go take a drive through downtown. Take a drive through the east side. Take a drive where some of the industries are being taken over. I know Turlock Gospel Mission has taken over a warehouse, and they're converting it into a shelter, which is amazing. But there's still a lot of empty stuff over there, folks. We have ruins. And ruins are just, again, more than old buildings. They're a reminder of greatness. They're a reminder of greatness. What can a church, a generational church, do among ruins? I believe Isaiah tried to do this. Isaiah said, what can a generational church do among ruins? He says this, you shall rise up, this again is verse 11, 58:11. You shall rise up the foundations of many generations. You will stand among your ancient ruins, and you shall rise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairers of the breach, the restorer of the streets to live in. I like this because there's a couple meanings here. Obviously, you're building the foundations of the generations who built Jerusalem before. So you have literal buildings being built. But I think there's something else here. You are building on the generations before you, of the power of people passing things down and doing life together. Multiple generations creates a foundation that is powerful and strong and overcomes ruined culture around us. It overcomes it. It is more powerful than it. It is stronger than it. It brings hope when things look hopeless. So it's not just values and truth that are passed down, by the way, which is important, passing our values down, passing doctrine down, passing truth down. But it means generations actively doing life together. It doesn't just mean we sit and we make sure that some of the older folks in our church teach the younger folks. Very important. That's very important. As a generational church, we are missing on some of that a little bit. But that's only part of it. It's the idea that we as different generations, me as a young adult, does life with the folks in our Seekers class on Sunday mornings. That I don't just come to church and maybe get a good lesson from them, but I sit and drink the coffee because theirs is the best. Sorry, it is. I've toured all the Sunday school classes. Theirs is better than the rest of yours. I'm sorry about that, okay? Maybe more experience, I don't know, stronger. It's just theirs is better. It is just better. That's why I think Jeff teaches there, because their coffee tastes better, okay? But I love going in there. I love being among all of our generations. I didn't like per se, but it was enjoyable to teach our 5th and 6th grade for 3 weeks. I pulled my hair out a little bit, but I was good. I survived the experience. I just gave them toys. That seemed to work pretty well. So we have this idea of doing life together. If this is our value, then how do we pass that on? Again, I say if, pencil, generational. If this is one of our core deep identities of who we are, how do we begin to do this together, this generational thing? How do we begin to experience and do life together in different ways? I like Deuteronomy. It speaks of the Shema, this saying like, love the Lord your God with all your mind, your heart, and your soul. And it says, pass that on to your kids. Get up in the morning and say it with them. And get up at night, say it with them. There's a power to generations. And churches that do not have that suffer. I read an article this week about a man who went out and he wanted to plant a church just for like 35 and under people, which would drive me crazy, okay? That's what he's going to do. He's going to go out and just draw this generation. And there's a good reason for that. Generation 35 and under doesn't go to church much. So he was going to build this church, rock bands, all this stuff, and it lasted about 3 years and fizzled because it had no foundation. It didn't have generations doing life together. It had one age group doing life together. And that only lasts so long in a church. And our church is much, much different. It's multiple generations doing life together. And I love this line. I love this line for us. You will be called the repairers of the breach. There is no greater breach in church. I was reading an article. This is not a joke. I was reading an article in the Journal a few years ago, and I thought it was a modern article, okay? And it's a church revival's coming to town. And it was like, hey, you know what? We don't know what this youth are doing today, and we don't know what they're crazy. They're out there doing their thing, and we don't know how to control them. We don't know why they don't want to go to church. We don't know why they don't want to know the Bible. And I looked at the top, and it was a classic edition from 1910. Things don't change. How people struggle change, how a generation changes from the 60s to the 2010s is a little different, but how we see each other doesn't change. There's a breach sometimes between our generations. When we commit to a generational foundation of the church, the words come out that we are the repairers of the breach. We fix and we mend and we solve problems and we do life together. And I love this to end in verse 13. It says this: if you refrain on trampling on my Sabbath, on church Sunday, and from pursuing your own interests on my holy day. When you come together for church, what do we pursue? I pursue the interests of my age group. I admit that to you. At times I see that I want to make sure we have the right worship for my age group and the right small groups, and at times I forget that we are a generational church and there are multiple things. We're looking out for other groups more than me. Imagine a church where we looked for that. I would like to extend this as a challenge to our church this morning. How do we, with generational values, pursue the needs of the other generations in our church first? And that's everybody. Now, I think we do this well, by the way. I think you see keys of our generational church as you see some of our folks from this service who sit and listen to Awana verses on a Tuesday night, who join our high school staff, our college staff, our junior high staff. Okay? We see the mixing well. We see it going well. So, there's two ways of thinking, I think, of church. The first way is this. I need to make sure my age group gets what it needs, period. I want to make sure I get my rights, and that's what I'm going to get. I'm going to get it. Now, I understand that, by the way, especially for some of you that are watching many churches lose services that include traditional worship. I fully understand that fear, and I'm committed as a pastor to keeping that style of worship here because it values the generations of our church. It values it, and that's why I'm committed to that, okay? That's why. But there's this idea, I got to make sure I get what my group wants. The other side of that says this: make sure other groups get what God needs them to have. I make sure that our church is supplying to every other generation what God needs them to do, okay? In this holy place of church, we celebrate that idea this morning. We celebrate a bigger idea. How do we stay strong in a time of recession and war and ruin? Last week we understood it was the hope and the truth. This week we understand it may be through the power of a generational church that God has put together and has nothing to do with you, by the way. He built us like this, okay? The power of listening to each other across generational boundaries. The power of being repairers of the breach. And it may mean that worship ministries are different for different age groups, and we celebrate that here at Crossroads Church. And it may mean wisdom is passed well from one generation to another. And maybe the junior hires teach us to risk a little more, and our older folks teach us to be a little more wise as we go forward. That is the power of a generational church.